Welcome, everyone. My name is Karen Walker. I am a member of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. And with Steve Pike, we co-chair the Academic Study Committee. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our first Monday forum with Allison Prasch. She is Associate Professor of Rhetoric, Politics, and Culture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Allison and I first met at the National Communication Association annual meeting last fall. My own background, I'm a scholar of rhetoric myself, and I was intrigued by the public address panel where several luminaries in our field were going to be chatting with Allison about her book, The World is Our Stage, The Global Rhetorical Presidency and the Cold War. And as a former USIA alum and State Department Foreign Affairs officer, I was delighted to learn that Allison had based her findings on archival research in the USIA archives, the State Department archives, and a lot of relevance to public diplomacy tradecraft. And in our role with the Academic Study Committee, our members are really looking for ways to broaden and deepen engagement between practitioners and scholars. And I thought that having Allison come chat with us about her book would be a great way to kick off that dialogue and perhaps lead to further collaboration. So with that, I would like to invite Allison to share some of the highlights from her book. And then my co-chair of the Academic Study Committee, Steve Pike, will open and moderate Q&A, and then we'll have closing remarks from our partners on the program committee. Thank you. Allison, over to you.
Thank you, Karen, so much. I appreciate it. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Karen, can you see that? Because yours is the only face I can see. Okay, great. Awesome. Well, I just wanted to start by thanking you all for joining us today, and to Karen for that generous introduction, and also to Steve Pike for inviting me to share some of my research with you all today. It's really a delight to be with you, especially in your roles as scholars and practitioners of public policy. And as I'll share throughout the course of this presentation, so much of my research and the findings of this book were made possible because of the work that individuals like you played and your contributions in the planning and coordination of US presidential trips abroad during the Cold War. During my various trips and experiences in the archives, I developed a newfound respect and appreciation for the work that you all do. And so it's really an honor to share some of my research in this space. As Karen mentioned, I am a rhetorical historian by training, and I've spent most of my scholarly career studying US presidential rhetoric from FDR to the present. I came to this project with a central question. How and why did US presidents use their foreign travel in an attempt to shape public opinion both at home and abroad during the Cold War? Where the two world wars were fought with tanks and bombs and military force, the Cold War quickly became a symbolic contest of words, images, and propaganda campaigns. And these contests blurred and spread beyond the boundaries of national identity as countries aligned themselves with either the United States or the Soviet Union. And so in this book, I examine a critical and yet understudied element of this rhetorical campaign. That is, how US presidents utilize their physical travel beyond the nation's own borders as a form or a mechanism of public diplomacy during the Cold War. And so in my remarks today, I want to focus on 4 specific vignettes, snapshots, if you will, of where and how the presidential practice of going global emerged as a diplomatic strategy during the second half of the 20th century. I've selected these examples to demonstrate both the motivation for these visits and to also feature the central role that public diplomacy practitioners played in bringing these visits to life. And so I want to begin, as many studies of US public diplomacy often do, with Dwight D. Eisenhower. Between December 1959 and June 1960, Eisenhower embarked on 3 missions of peace and goodwill, spanning countries in Europe, South America, Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. The president and other US officials devoted enormous time and attention to orchestrating global tours that would simultaneously project a positive image of the United States abroad and help the US public see their president as a global emissary for peace. Now, the inspiration for these tours came after a sweeping Democratic victory in the 1958 midterm elections. Eisenhower was concerned about his historical legacy, and his advisors helped him to design a plan for his final 2 years in office. In a memo written to Eisenhower in December of 1958, James Haggerty, Eisenhower's press secretary and close advisor, argued that the president could transform what might be considered a lame duck office into a decidedly advantageous position by going directly to the American people with his policy proposals. And in the realm of foreign policy, Haggerty argued, Eisenhower should reclaim his mantle of leadership. The conduct of foreign affairs is exclusively the responsibility of the president, Haggerty wrote. But there are some politicians, particularly in the Congress, and more particularly in the Senate, who are trying to muscle their way into this area to weaken the responsibility of the president. Now, despite Haggerty's incorrect assertion that the president and the president alone makes US foreign policy, this statement offers a critical insight into how the Eisenhower administration saw the president's symbolic role in foreign affairs. One way that Haggerty believed Eisenhower could exert his position on the world stage was through carefully orchestrated and highly publicized global tours. There is no one in the world who can speak for America like the president, Haggerty argued. And he told Eisenhower that his position was one of great prestige and great power, one that should be used to the maximum, more so than has been used to date. In fact, he concluded, we should gamble more with the office of the president in foreign affairs, in foreign public relations. Eisenhower took his press secretary's advice, and he completed trips to every nation or region on Haggerty's list, with the exception of Russia and Japan, between December 1959 and June of 1960. Now, a desire behind Eisenhower's goodwill tours was this hope to create, to circulate, and to maintain a very particular image of the US president and the nation to audiences at home and abroad. Even as the administration sought to elevate national prestige, it also used these tours to remind the US public of Eisenhower's widespread popularity. For example, in the lead up to Eisenhower's tour of Latin America in the spring of 1960, the White House issued clear instructions to journalists who would travel with the president and to US Embassy staff stationed in South America. Haggerty wrote to them to make sure that the press who would be covering Eisenhower could see and report on the reception afforded the president by people in any particular city. Ultimately, he wrote, it should be explained that these are the men who will report the reception accorded the president around the world. And if they are so far back that they cannot see or hear what is going on, then their stories will lack the reporting and the warmth of the reception, and it will be detrimental both to the nation concerned and to the United States. In a similar vein, Abbott Washburn, the deputy director of the USIA, wrote that the agency's job was to, quote, protect the image of the president's personality to our audiences overseas, who will not have the opportunity to see him or hear him in person, and to sustain the impact of the trip after it is over. And this would happen, according to the USIA, through films that would be distributed to posts around the world. But regardless of whether these images of Eisenhower were circulated to diplomatic posts or sent back to the United States, in all cases, these visuals were designed to portray Eisenhower as a confident, charismatic leader being greeted by cheering crowds in countries and regions around the world. Now, although Eisenhower was the one to inaugurate the deliberate use of presidential travel as a Cold War persuasive tactic, the story does not end with Eisenhower, and in fact, in many ways, it is only the beginning. In December 1960, just weeks before Eisenhower left office, the President's Committee on Information Activities Abroad, or the SPRAG Committee, published its final report to the president. In its executive summary, the committee predicted that the eventual outcome of the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union would depend in considerable degree on the extent that we are able to influence the attitudes of people. One of the most effective ways to increase the United States' general prestige in the world, the committee concluded, was through the president's decision to go global. Visits to other countries by the president or the secretary of state can have extraordinary political and psychological value, they wrote. To the extent possible, they should be planned and managed in ways which will increase and prolong their favorable impact on local leaders and populations. All future US presidents would follow this advice, beginning with Eisenhower's successor, John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy's oft-cited Ich bin ein Berliner Declaration in June of 1963 remains a standard bearer for Cold War presidential rhetoric. Indeed, after Kennedy's visit, numerous presidents would go to Berlin in an attempt to do as Kennedy had done. What I want to focus on today, however, is why US diplomatic personnel believed that Kennedy's visit to West Berlin was so essential for the administration's larger foreign policy goals, especially at a moment when many US citizens were focused on another site of democratic struggle, Birmingham, Alabama. In the beginning of April 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference initiated the Birmingham Campaign, a set of strategic marches, protests, and sit-ins throughout the city. Although the campaign garnered national and international attention from the very beginning, the events of May 3rd forever changed the narrative about civil rights in the United States. The Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, ordered local officials to use high-pressure fire hoses, police dogs, and billy clubs to stop over 1,000 African-American children and teenagers from protesting in the streets of Birmingham. Photographs of this state-sanctioned violence sparked widespread outrage both at home and abroad. And the realities of segregation and Jim Crow were made visible to US citizens and the rest of the world, causing many to ask how proponents of a so-called free world democratic system could deny basic rights to its own citizens. As the Chicago Defender, a historically Black newspaper, opined, the events unfolding in Birmingham and elsewhere were an American crisis 100 years in the making.
Hi, Joe. This is Cynthia. Oh, hi, Cynthia.
For Americans, the paper continued, this moment also
we're in the middle of the first Monday.
A new kind of
Allison Prasch is on, yeah. And if you're
a new kind of crisis. Instead, for Havana, Moscow, or Berlin, the places involved were in many instances their hometowns: Birmingham, Jackson, Greensboro, Raleigh, Tallahassee, Philadelphia, and New York. All figured in the crisis, which stemmed from the sugar-coated segregation of the North to flagrant civil rights violations in the South. In Washington, journalists and politicians suggested that Kennedy should cancel his European tour and attend to making federal civil rights legislation at home a reality. In a June 4th syndicated column that it appears to have struck a nerve within the Kennedy White House, Walter Lippmann argued that the president needs to have mastered the crisis in American national life before he can speak with self-confidence on the cause of democracy in world affairs. Lippmann was not alone, and a number of outlets, including the New York Times editorial page, called for Kennedy to cancel his trip. Even after Kennedy's June 11, 1963 televised speech to the nation on civil rights, the White House debated whether or not the president should proceed. And behind the scenes, Kennedy himself was especially worried about the optics of the trip. The president's concern was captured by Frederick Vreeland, a CIA officer stationed at the U.S. Embassy in Bonn and temporarily detailed to the National Security Council in Washington to help prepare Kennedy for his visit to Berlin. Vreeland wrote, "You asked me last night why you should go to Europe in view of the objections expressed by Mr. Lippmann, the New York Times, and others, and what you can accomplish in Germany." Vreeland would go on to explain that if Kennedy decided to stay home, the public and governmental reaction in West Berlin and West Germany would be one of shock, disbelief, and profound disillusionment. Kennedy was on the verge of achieving an East-West détente, he wrote, or even an acceptable Berlin arrangement, and he believed that canceling the visit would have disastrous effects. But ultimately, Vreeland wrote, the president's visit would reassure West Germans of US support. By your presence and statements in West Berlin, where you will get an emotional welcome such as you have never experienced, you will provide the Berliners with the reassurance they require during a period of protracted cold squeeze, such as they are now experiencing, even more than a hot squeeze, when after all, we demonstrate our policy by deeds rather than words. In the end, Kennedy, as we know, decided to go forward with the trip, and he argued that a bold articulation of free world global leadership was needed. Kennedy advisor and speechwriter Ted Sorensen would later recall that the president had, quote, reached a point where he felt perhaps it would be better to divert attention from civil rights for a while, because legislation was going to take a long time. The trip, Sorensen explained, was one of those events which helped divert the attention of the nation, as well as his own. Now, this idea of diverting attention from Birmingham to Berlin is further substantiated by Washington Post writer Carol Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick would cite senior administration officials who explained that Kennedy believed canceling the trip would, quote, be abandoning his role as a leader at the most critical time and be a sad admission which would undermine faith in America. It's essential to note, however, that the unspoken premise was that Kennedy's presence was required at a most critical time abroad, not at a moment of racial crisis at home. In this view, the president's trip to West Berlin became quite literally a strategic means of deflection or distraction from very real issues of racial violence, segregation, and white supremacy in the United States. The nation and the world had witnessed firsthand the state-sanctioned acts of violence against Black Americans through images circulated around the world. By going to Berlin, Kennedy believed he could offer a more flattering image of the United States, not just for West Berliners, but also to the US public. Now, where Eisenhower and Kennedy saw their international tours as a way to speak to a global public, Richard Nixon also understood the power of a newfound medium to reach a domestic US audience, leading up to his 1972 re-election campaign. Indeed, the advent of live cable news coverage was a central feature in the planning and execution of Nixon's 1972 opening to China. In the book, I have much more to say about the diplomatic motivations and the historical narrative leading up to this monumental visit, but today I want to focus on our attention on how Nixon and advisors sought to use this trip to reach US voters and a global audience going into the 1972 presidential election. Now, given the historic nature of the visit to China, the Nixon White House developed and implemented a massive public relations campaign both before and during the trip. Archival documents, both in the Nixon archives and also the archives of the State Department and USIA, demonstrate how the administration worked to ensure that Nixon's trip would be transmitted instantaneously all over the world. Officials refused to leave any element of this political spectacle to chance, and they obsessed over how they might control press coverage of the trip. One way they worked around this media filter was to broadcast the trip live to the US public as much as possible, even despite the 13-hour time difference between Washington and Beijing. It is critically important that we make available the maximum amount of picture of the president in China so we can wind up controlling to a considerable extent what appears on the screen, wrote former journalist and White House Special Advisor John Scully. The more pictures we make available of the spectacle of the presidents in China, the more we wind up dominating in a positive way what appears. Without this live coverage, Scully predicted, network producers would rely on delayed sound bites and so-called China experts, who would no doubt be critical of the president. This strategy of live cable news would allow the administration to, quote, dominate, unquote, the news coverage by providing the networks a cleverly packaged spectacle that was ready to air. In fact, Scully wrote, a prudent man would plan on this as the big plus as the president faces re-election. The China trip has all the ingredients of a powerful asset which can help offset domestic issues. And the sheer drama of the president's visit to Peking will not be equaled for many years to come. As it turns out, Scully's predictions were accurate. A Gallup poll taken just days after Nixon's return from the People's Republic of China revealed that 98% of those surveyed had heard or read about the president's trip. And this was the highest awareness score of any event registered in the history of the organization. Likewise, in their post-trip analysis, NBC's research department estimated that 100 million viewers saw some portion of the three networks' coverage of the opening to China. This massive public awareness campaign even extended to global public opinion. According to a survey conducted by the USIA after the trip, Nixon's visit to China achieved one of the highest levels of awareness ever recorded in international public opinion surveys, with only the Soviets' first space satellite and America's manned moon landing registering higher levels of awareness. It's important to note, however, that the opening to China looms large in the global imaginary because that was precisely Nixon's intention from the very beginning. It was a trip designed to capture US public attention and to dominate the media landscape, both at home and abroad. The president and his advisors envisioned a live television spectacle broadcast from the heart of what they had up to this point called Red China. And they believed that this near constant news coverage would so mesmerize the US public that they would not be able to look away. This televised drama created between two former enemies they believed would cement Nixon's legacy in world affairs and propel him to re-election in November 1972. These explicit political goals were not some accessory or casual aside. They motivated, animated, and dictated every detail of the trip. This brings me to my final vignette, which also is the subject of the last content chapter of my book. And it's also designed to hopefully transition us into our larger discussion together. When Reagan spoke at Pointe du Hoc to commemorate the 40th anniversary of D-Day in 1984, he made the realities of the past present to those watching, both at home and abroad. Now, the White House was explicit in its timing, just as the Nixon White House was. They timed it so that Reagan's speech would be broadcast live over the morning news cycle back in the United States. The ultimate goal, wrote White House speechwriter Peggy Noonan later, was to cause teenagers eating their Rice Krispies to stop and sit back and think, history is real. Reagan's address at Pointe du Hoc is often cited as an exemplar of presidential commemoration. And part of this has to do with his moving, eloquent description of what the boys of Pointe du Hoc accomplished on D-Day. But as I argue in the book, this narrative was made possible because of how Reagan frequently reminded his audience of what the place of his address, Pointe du Hoc, had come to represent, and how he spoke directly to the 62 surviving US Army Rangers who had scaled the cliffs behind him. And you can see those individuals sitting in dark suits here in this horseshoe formation in front of Reagan on the screen. Reagan's linking of presidential speech with bodies in place made this type of commemoration possible. Now, when I finalized my book manuscript in December of 2021, I argued that, quote, all future presidential addresses in Normandy would be compared to Reagan's commemorative campaign, unquote. What I could not have predicted at that time, however, was just how true this statement would become only 3 months ago on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Since Reagan's address at Pointe du Hoc 40 years ago, all US presidents except for George W. Bush have spoken at various points or sites along the Normandy coast, but none had returned to Pointe du Hoc until Biden. On June 6, 2024, Biden spoke from the exact same spot that Reagan did 40 years earlier. He delivered very similar remarks, noting the heroism of that day and recounting the experiences of the US Army Rangers who scaled the cliffs behind him. And like Reagan, Biden used the occasion to speak about a cause that motivated those heroes 80 years ago, the belief in democracy. He said, as we gather here today, it's not just to honor those who showed such remarkable bravery that day on June 6, 1944. It's to listen to the echo of their voices, to hear them, because they're summoning us, and they're summoning us now. They're asking, what will we do? They're not asking us to scale these cliffs. They're asking us to stay true to what America stands for. As I watched this speech live, I could not help but marvel at how Biden appealed directly to the US public in a way that no other American president has done from this site. Normandy has served as a backdrop for projecting US global leadership against tyranny. But Biden used this moment to tell his fellow citizens that the best way to honor the memory of those who fought on D-Day was to protect freedom in our time, to defend democracy, and to stand up to aggression abroad and at home. This is an argument that Biden has made many times over the course of his presidency, but it is one that I would argue he crystallized at Pointe-à-Hawk through his presence in place. Biden suggested that the ultimate lesson of D-Day was the reminder that democracy must be protected at home, even as he spoke from abroad. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Allison, I want to thank you. Just for the audience, hi, as Karen Walker said, I'm Steve Pike. We are the co-chairs of the Academic Study Committee, and I am coming to you today from lovely Syracuse, New York, where fall has arrived. But Allison, thank you so much for such a really illuminating presentation. Everybody on this call at some level has been involved in stagecraft, and we know it's there. But to tease out, as you did with this research, these wonderful lines of exactly what the strategy was, exactly what they were thinking, to tie it back to the domestic audience, not, I mean, you were telling us about Nixon, and I can almost hear Billy Flynn in Chicago singing, "Give him the old razzle dazzle and we'll make you a star." But moreover, to draw the line between Presidents Reagan and President Biden, to say, look, one is evoking this imagery and the other comes back and evokes it again because it is powerful. This is really wonderful. So I want to encourage people out there to start thinking of questions you'd like to ask. You can place them in the chat, and we've got the chat here, and we'll see what we've got as it comes in. Let me start us off, though, if I may, just while people are thinking. I've got one here. I was listening very intently to what you're telling us about Eisenhower, right? We don't want you to be a lame duck president. We want you to rise above politics, right? We want you to be that image of the president for all Americans. And that's a very common image that gets evoked. But as I was sort of leaning in down there to look at the memo, I noticed a few points where he said, well, you know, we could have some new faces in Congress and it kind of wouldn't hurt if it favored. So I'm going to give you two images and you tell me if I'm overreading. One is, Mr. President, we want you to play politics that favors our party in Congress without looking like you're playing politics that favors our party in Congress. And the other is, there's this old sense that as presidents get into the end of their tenure, last 2 years, they turn to foreign policy because they've either done everything they're going to get done domestically or they're totally stymied and nothing's moving. And foreign policy is a place where the president has a pretty independent, they can almost write their own script without too much interference. What do you think of those two images? Am I onto something here?
I think, yeah, no, I think you absolutely are. You know, what's interesting with Eisenhower, and again, these are just, you know, snippets from thousands of memos that, you know, it's really hard to distill, but the overall sense I got, specifically as it comes to Eisenhower and his decision in 1958 to kind of begin this strategy, is that it is motivated both by his desire to be seen as influential and monumental in global affairs, quite particularly. And it is also a way for him to underscore his belief that Republicans are best suited to handle affairs of statescraft. One of the things that happens is, I said that, you know, Eisenhower goes to all the places that Hagerty should say that he goes, but the first trip is really strategically framed and designed around his visit to India. Because for Eisenhower and the concern about, at that point, you know, quote unquote, Red China, the Soviet Union, are we going to have kind of a hold in that particular geographic region? Eisenhower is convinced that one of the best ways he can solidify India's support for the United States in this bipolar contest is by him going there personally. And so he really relishes the images of him traveling, the widespread news coverage. He appears on the cover of Life in the early days of 1960. And for him, this is what is going to make him successful as he leaves office.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me ask you a second one while we're while the audience is thinking. I note there's something of a chronological distinction here in the whole scope of the book. The cases you principally analyzed are after World War II, and it's moving forward from there. And they seem to have a pretty good ideological focus at times on the competition between global capitalism, global communism, whether that's actually the sincere, complete purpose, or whether it's like, well, hey, look, it's a good backdrop. Let's use this. But there's a lot of focus there. That said, there's a history, and you uncover a bit of this that goes back before World War II. It includes President Ulysses S. Grant, President Teddy Roosevelt, President Woodrow Wilson, and President Franklin Roosevelt before World War II. I wonder if you could elaborate on what's the importance of those historical roots.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, well, you have to go back even before Grant, because if you recall, and something that we always start with my students when we teach foreign policy rhetoric is that both Washington and Jefferson will issue various statements saying we need to avoid entangling alliances. We need to basically mind our own business, keep our focus on affairs of the nation, and not be engaged in foreign policy. Now, that looks different for them in different ways, but this phrase, avoid entangling alliances, is going to have this really lengthy history, and it has a real staying power over chief executives. For example, Ulysses S. Grant is invited to go to Canada to celebrate the opening of a railroad, and he doesn't go because there is this, standing precedent. He argues that a president doesn't leave the borders of the nation while in office. Now, presidents travel abroad either before they're president or after they're president, but this idea that you're going to leave while in office is something that's really frowned upon. But Teddy Roosevelt in 1906 becomes the first U.S. president to travel beyond the borders of the nation while in office. And it's a huge deal, and people are really concerned about it. But I would argue, and what I do in the beginning of the book, is that when we start to see Roosevelt, when we see Wilson going to Versailles, when we see Franklin D. Roosevelt making various trips, whether it's in thinking about Latin American policy or then during World War II when he's attending the Big Three conferences with Stalin and Churchill. In all of those cases, the decision by the president to leave the borders of the nation is always an expression or a reflection of U.S. foreign policy. And so for Teddy Roosevelt, that means he's going to the Panama Canal Zone because he wants to go there, as he says, and see for himself what's going on in the big ditch so that he can come back and convince the U.S. public that it's a worthy investment, both in terms of financial resources, in terms of labor, economy, capital, all of that. But it's really an extension of this, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine of U.S. influence in South America, the same for Wilson, the same for Roosevelt. And so, although in the book I do focus on the Cold War because based on all my research, I feel comfortable making the argument that it's really during the Cold War where this becomes a deliberate strategy of persuasion. Prior to FDR, yes, it is used and it reflects U.S. foreign policy, but Eisenhower is really the one that says, I'm concerned about my legacy. I want to convince people to join with the United States. And so I'm going to go abroad or go global so that people are persuaded to join with the United States and not the Soviet Union. But from the very beginning, it has been this tactic that has been used to express and display the goals or the intentions of U.S. foreign policy. And so one way to read U.S. foreign policy is to trace where presidents have gone. And it really tells you a lot about their goals and motivations.
And I think that distinction, that switch over of the motivation is one that, this group is particularly keen on, because that was in some sense the founding reason of our agency. Let me, we do have a couple of questions here. From one colleague, I'm impressed by the extent that USIA and colleagues were used for domestic political purposes, not usually part of our mission, and indeed, we're not supposed to be part of domestic politics. And he just wondered, do you have a reaction to that?
Yes. Excellent question. I will say, when I went into this project, I was very intent on the papers of the president, in various presidential libraries. And I knew I wanted to rely on State Department memos because I knew that there was some coordination. What I was not prepared for was finding just the widespread inclusion of USIA memorandum whether that it shows up in White House records, it shows up in State Department records. I did draw on USIA files at the National Archives, but if anyone who's been there to do work there, there's a lot there, and it's also quite disorganized. And so the majority of actually what I found are these kind of breadcrumbs that go through the White House, or they go through the State Department. And so that was really something surprising to me, so much so that, it was very routine for people in the White House who were planning these trips to be talking about so-and-so in the USIA or exchanging clippings of what they saw broadcast. I don't feel quite prepared to make an editorial comment about it, but I will say that I was also quite surprised. And, one thing that I think is really important in doing archival research is even when you are surprised that you follow through on it, because it's there and it's a record. And that helps us tell the story.
Thank you. Another question from a colleague. Are there other presidential trips that you want to highlight? If you do a second edition, which ones are going to make the second cut? But are there other presidential trips where you think it's worth highlighting? Maybe there's a thread that works through them, or some of your favorite recent speeches that might be triggering that interest. Let me dig a little further on that one.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, two that I did not include in the book because the book needed to end. But I would say Lyndon Johnson's decision to go to Vietnam, and Jimmy Carter's decision to go to Iran. And both are significant, both are important. I will be honest, I wanted the book to end, but I also knew that those are probably deserving of books in and of themselves because of the level of complication embedded in those visits. But I think it's really interesting that we often know about or hear about Kennedy in Berlin, for example, Nixon in China, Reagan in Normandy. And I was deliberate about wanting to highlight those examples because I thought that the archival research could tell us something new. In terms of recent speeches or addresses, what I've been realizing over the last 20 years, I think, is that when we talk about presidential speech, it matters just as much what we see visually and how those visits are communicated or circulated in terms of a visual presence. And maybe the verbal does not matter as much in particular instances. For example, when Biden made the decision to go to Israel in October following the horrific attack by Hamas, people don't really remember or talk about what he said exactly, but they can see those images or remember that he was there. And so I think that's something to consider as we think about presidential rhetoric more broadly, is that it's not just the text, although that matters, but it's also what we see of it, how it's orchestrated, and then how publics respond to that.
There's an old adage in communications: they'll never quite remember what you said, but they'll remember forever how you made them feel about it. And then that seems to be operating there. I'm going to jump around a little in questions because there's another one that takes an interesting flip of the coin on this. Have you ever seen this tactic used on us? Have you observed a couple of foreign heads of state who have maybe come to the US to do a little bit of that foreign diplomacy and broadcast it to their people back home?
Yes, so two quick examples I'll give you. One of them is related to Eisenhower. So in September of 1959, Nikita Khrushchev comes here. He comes to the United States. He is here, I believe it's 12 days. And he travels all around the country. He goes to Disneyland. He is given airtime to deliver a primetime speech to the nation. And this is one thing I didn't get to mention, but there are these memos that are just horrified that Khrushchev is going to come here and everybody's going to love him. And they're going to say, there's really nothing wrong with communism. What are we going to do? And I will just say, I spent hours searching for a deliberate link between Khrushchev's visit to the United States, because it's right at the same moment that Eisenhower decides to start embarking on his global tours. And I have not found that paper trail, but it is a part of the calculation because that is seen as wildly successful. And the White House is concerned about that. And so they're determined to flip the narrative. The second example that I would say is thinking about the most recent visit of the Chinese president in California. And there was a this was a few months ago, and there was an article that just came out in the New York Times talking very specifically about how the Chinese government was attempting to use that visit for more than what was seen on the surface. And so I think it is something that happens often. And I think that presence in place is used very deliberately and strategically. It's the reason that Biden went to Ukraine on that secret mission, but it's also the reason that, Volodymyr Zelensky has been invited to deliver addresses to a joint session of Congress. It means something to see those people in particular places.
Tell me if I'm correct here, the Khrushchev trip, that's the one where they sent Vice President Nixon to have the famous kitchen debate. It was a mock-up of a kitchen at somewhere, but they sent Nixon to take him on precisely because they didn't want this to go unchallenged.
Right, exactly. And then, Eisenhower was scheduled to visit Moscow in June of 1960. Everything was arranged, everything was set, and then something called the U-2 incident happened. And Khrushchev rescinds the invitation, cancels the entire trip. And so the third and final goodwill tour that Eisenhower takes is essentially a redirection of what was supposed to be going to Moscow, and they make it this tour of Asia. And so it's, again, this attempt to kind of make up for this mistake. But it was supposed to be a reciprocal visit. That's how it was originally planned.
Interesting. Let me see. Here's another question. Presidential visits often feature deliverables, bilateral agreements, commitments of assistance. Essentially, you got to give the other side something to get them in on the visit. Have you seen things like that in the research? Does that factor in what you're doing? Do you consider the significance of that?
Excellent question. It very much does show up in the archives. Probably the clearest example of that would be in thinking about Nixon's opening to China and the famous communique that comes out of those negotiations. Those often happen, and the archival documents related to those deliverables often are happening not in the White House Office of Speechwriting, or not in the USIA, or not in thinking about that kind of public relations, public-facing narrative. So I do consider those and ask what their impact might be, but I'm always reading this as a rhetorician through the lens of how did the president and their advisors seek to persuade publics? Because what I can tell you is that in the archives, in the example of China, I shouldn't say none of, because I'm always aware that although I rely on a historical record, there are pieces that existed that are not in that record, so I don't want to make blanket statements. Very few, if any, of those public opinion surveys are asking, do you care about the China communique? They're asking about, what did you see of the visit? And so I think communiques or deliverables are directed at different audiences. And so for more of like a foreign policy or a foreign service audience, that's really significant and important. But to the general public, that's not where their focus or attention was.
Thank you. Another one, you talked a little bit about the research material, and we had talked about that earlier, you and I, when we were chatting. Did you explore the extent to which USIA's foreign opinion research surveys or other material from USA archives were used by the White House and US embassies in pre-trip decisions? In other words, what role did USIA at the time actively play in advising, well, here's how we see it, here's what you can expect?
This is such a great question. And I recognize that I am talking to the experts here on USIA, so I will just say that up front. One of the things that's really fascinating is, because I am a close textual critic, and by that I mean I am very intentional that I do not want to draw historical inferences that are not there, while also seeking to understand the realities of the moment. There are a number of fascinating USIA public opinion surveys in the USIA archives that will do pre and post-trip analysis. So for example, this is what people in just one country or multiple like representative countries think about the United States, think about Eisenhower, think about Nixon, think about Kennedy. And then they will follow that up with a post-trip report, essentially making an argument of how did that opinion change. My difficulty is that rarely did I find copies of those memoranda sitting in the White House office. But we also know that the USIA was very involved in planning all of these. And so this is also a culture in which you pick up the phone and call someone. You have these conversations between individuals. And so I'm quite confident they did play a role in making decisions of, where do we go? Who are we most concerned about public opinion wise? Who do we need to win over towards the US side versus the Soviet Union side? Those documents are there and they're very much a part of the story. But I have not been able to make a direct link to direct decisions because I don't have the memo in the file from that individual.
There's no record of a phone call.
Exactly.
No,
Right.
and a lot of these things are quiet conversations.
Yep.
Let me again turn over a coin here and let's look at the other side of it. Did you see any places, because you did mention in the Kennedy trip to Berlin that there was a division. People thought, if you do this, it's going to look like you're trying to avoid Birmingham, or you could do this to try to look like you're deflecting from Birmingham. It could turn out either way. So did you see any evidence of cases where either the White House didn't consider the domestic implications of a trip by the president, or where the trip actually backfired?
Yeah, so the example that I will give, I'll just say as a first part of the answer, the domestic implications are always considered. But I think it's also important to remember within a Cold War context, so many US presidents see the domestic as underneath the foreign policy or the global concerns because, and this again goes back to Eisenhower, this belief that if you are a real patriotic American citizen, you are most concerned with defeating communism and that way of life at home and abroad. So domestic concerns really are secondary to global ones. And that's kind of this overarching frame. That's going to change with various things. I think notably Vietnam is going to start having some of those shifts. But the domestic is always considered even as it's used in the service of the global. But the example that I would give to you, I noted earlier how Eisenhower is supposed to go to Moscow to meet with Khrushchev in June of 1960, completely falls apart after the U-2 incident. And so the White House is scrambling to try and figure out what are we going to do? Where's Eisenhower going to go? We can't make this look like it's a blow to US prestige. And so they very quickly plan this trip to Asia. He goes to 4 or 5 different countries, but when he goes to Japan, there are massive protests in Japan, specifically over US military bases that are remaining after World War II. And the protests are so intense that they actually cancel the trip. When James Hagerty, who's serving on the advanced team, Hagerty did everything. But when Hagerty's there in an advanced team, there's this story in the archives about how Hagerty and 2 of his associates are in a car and they have to get helicoptered out because they're being pelted by rotten tomatoes and apples. And they're worried for their safety. But Eisenhower essentially digs in his heels and says, no, we're still going to go. I'm not going to give in to the communists. They're not going to stop me from going there. And I believe that we have a friend in Japan. And so there's back and forth cables overnight. And finally, the Japanese government does cancel the visit. And what's so fascinating is that all of the missives coming in from the State Department cables, public opinion surveys, USIA surveys, they are all centered around this question of not only what is global public opinion, but a really deep concern over US domestic public opinion. And how does the US audience understand the United States' role in the world, and particularly Eisenhower and the belief that he had been snubbed so badly that it was going to have disastrous effects for this legacy he was attempting to create. And so I think, it's just another example to demonstrate how within this Cold War mindset, especially for Eisenhower and Kennedy, that these 2 things are always linked. And it's this assumption that the domestic will really be in service of the foreign affairs.
And look, this is a phenomenon that happens at more than just this level and still happens today. Just as 2 quick examples, I'll throw out Secretary Anthony Blinken's trip to China getting canceled because of the balloons.
Yep.
And Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi saying, I'm going to Taiwan, and China's opinion on that may not be my most important factor, shall we say. there's a couple of questions here that pursue two avenues, one rhetorical and one technological. Let's take the rhetorical one first. There's a lot of reference in these sequential speeches to freedom and liberty. So does that kind of come up a lot? Is that one of the major themes? The other version of that question was the post-Cold War narrative of American exceptionalism. So let me try to package that up and say we've got the freedom and liberty theme, we've got the American exceptionalism theme potentially in there. Are those indeed prominent themes, and do you see a couple of others that seem to really sort of recur?
It's a great question. Freedom and liberty and the democracy being worth saving and protecting is very much an overarching narrative. And in fact, I think you can say both in these instances and then others that I was not able to include more broadly, it is the embodied act of the president moving from the United States to these other places or regions that is really viewed as rhetorical. And what I mean by that is it's not just that the president is going to deliver words, although those words matter, but you see in many of these surveys or these post-trip reports, people talking about, and on the ground, USIA officers or diplomatic personnel from embassies talking about, I was having conversations with people in this town or this region, and they were saying what it meant to them to see Eisenhower, for example, or what it meant for West Berliners to see Kennedy in Berlin. And so it is as much the words that are spoken as it is the presence or the visual importance of the president. And I think that's one of the reasons that this emphasis on the visual is so important. I think this idea of American exceptionalism is absolutely true in terms of how presidents talk about the United States as being the exemplar of democracy. And part of this has to do with the fact that, obviously leading the Big Three alliance, bringing to the end of World War II. I mean, Eisenhower, it's no accident that Eisenhower, who is responsible for D-Day and that success and ending the Second World War, then comes and devotes kind of that military precision and strategy to thinking about public diplomacy and how to speak to the nation and the world. But in all of those cases, a central theme is that the United States is exceptional, even in moments when we're not. Even when Kennedy is going to go to Berlin to deflect attention from Birmingham, the United States is exceptional, and we will come and tell you why so that you can want to mimic us. Now, I think that there are some problems with that strategy, but it very much is an overarching theme in the archive.
Indeed, fascinating. Let's take the technological side. And I mean, I heard a little bit of this, with Nixon's decision, hey, man, we can do this live, right? And specifically to control the narrative, not let the news media edit it down the way and contextualize it as they would. Have you seen the role of technology sort of marching along with this, whether it is the advent of live satellite television, cable networks, and now, I know this is a hugely broad question, into the social media era? Can you say something about how the change of technology has walked along with the effort by presidents to do this?
It absolutely has. And in fact, you can really notice how presidents and their advisors seek to capitalize on or harness these new technological advances. There's this really fascinating bit from the archive in the Nixon archive from those memos that I was talking about, where Scully actually writes, what we want to happen is that the family comes home after school and work, and the daughter will say, Daddy, get up from the dinner table. The president's in China. We have to watch. And so they're very aware of this culture that is developing over the ability to have live satellite TV and what that means to a US public and how they're experiencing that. Obviously, the Reagan administration really harnesses this for Normandy, but I think within the context of our current moment, for example, you think about the role of images, particularly when it comes to the Obama administration, and how various photographers, in particular Pete Souza, who was the White House chief photographer, was very intent on making sure that images of the presidency, not just the words, but the images, were really part of the narrative and part of the story. And then I think it's important to remember, we might all remember when Donald Trump says, he tweets out that he's going to visit North Korea, and then he does so. And based upon all the journalistic reports that we have, this was not cleared with advisors or, foreign service personnel. The tweet is sent and it happens. And it also speaks to this idea of technology and the speed at which things move, so that, this diplomatic event that could go many different ways happens simply just because of the push of the
I
button.
heard, hey, I'm going EAP, to put it lightly. One last question, because we are coming close on time, just to sort of shift it a bit. We've talked about the president. How about the first ladies? Jackie Kennedy was very effective. I hosted trips with First Lady Hillary Clinton, First Lady Laura Bush. Have you seen sort of a similar use of the first lady's position and her image, and thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think what I have noticed is that historically, the First Lady has been deployed in situations and circumstances in which her specific policies that she focuses on, or kind of her suite of characteristics, or the things that are really kind of in her wheelhouse, are of most importance. I think this also goes to a larger conversation about the expectation that has been historically true, that statescraft and foreign policy for a very long time was believed to be a male domain. And so this idea that if someone is going to make foreign policy, it is the male president, and that the female first lady is going to be deployed for other venues. I think that that's shifting and changing. I think, as you noted, at the time, First Lady Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton really made some remarkable strides in that area. And obviously, if and when we have a first gentleman, what that will look like. But I would say, in conclusion, I think that the First Lady also has the ability to do things and say things under the guise of them being less politically motivated or charged, that can actually be more effective. I mean, think about, women's rights are human rights. Like, that's a remarkable declaration that then First Lady Hillary Clinton makes, and she's able to do it in the way that she does it because she is speaking as the First Lady. And so I think negotiating those tensions is always a consideration.
Thank you so much for doing all this. We are getting very close to time. I want to thank you on behalf of myself and Karen and PDCA for this hour of incredibly interesting material, just great conversation. It's a fantastic book.
Thank you.
I think I might like you to come talk to my grad students, if you don't mind.
I'm happy to.
You're going to get a lot of offers after this call for that. But Allison, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for sharing this with us, and thank you for the great research. And I look forward not only to part 2, but to part 3.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thanks.
You're welcome. Let me say just one quick word about the Academic Study Committee before I turn this back to our president, Joel Fishman. It's a brand new committee that Karen Walker and I co-chair. Our purpose is to try to bring practitioners and scholars of public diplomacy together. And for interesting dialogues like this, but also for practical reasons. The scholars are still working on defining what PD is, its actors, its roles, its tools, its methods. It's a relatively young academic field, even if it's a very old practice. But I think we think there's an important role here for practitioners and scholars to help each other out. Practitioners can help scholars understand the real problems and challenges practitioners face, and kind of but the scholars can also have the time and space to strategize solutions to real problems that practitioners face. We'd like to become a clearinghouse for conversation, so please come to our dialogues, but also tell us what you need, all right? Practitioners, what solutions do you need from the scholars? Scholars help you advance your research, and then let's start making matches and seeing if we can solve some problems. And the most important thing is we're going to be helping to elevate the voice and profile of PD in Washington, and we strongly believe that this committee can help contribute to that really important PDCA. And with that, thank you all for attending. And I'm going to turn it over to Ashman for the final word.
Thank you, Steve. Before I close, I want to turn it over to Gordon Duguid, co-chair of our program committee, who may want to make a few remarks.
Well, thank you, Joel, and thank you, Allison, for an excellent presentation, and Stephen for teasing out lots of points that really illuminated Allison's research. I note that it is important for all of us to keep in mind, and Allison's research points this out, that public diplomacy is a policy function, that things that practitioners in the field do are part of the policy process. And so very often we have to make that argument, even though it should be self-evident. But it is nice to have actual academic research that backs up that point. And so for any of our rising members, that's the one takeaway I think that you can add to this excellent presentation, is that the work of public diplomats is policy work. Joel, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Gordon. And thank you, Allison. And thank you to our new Academic Study Committee co-chairs, Karen Walker and Steve Pike, and to today's tech host, Tuck Fellow, Gabby Stahl. Today was the first presentation of our Academic Study Committee. We look forward to many more initiatives that the committee is considering that will enhance PDCA's understanding and commitment to the success of public diplomacy. Join us 2 weeks from today on Monday, September 23rd at 12 noon, when our special guest will be Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Camille Dawson. Ms. Dawson is one of the first 2 recipients of PDCA's award to senior officers for outstanding leadership in public diplomacy. This will be a hybrid program, in person at the University of Southern California Capitol Campus here in DC, and online. Further information is available in the PDCA Weekly Update, which arrives in our inboxes on Sunday mornings, and on the PDCA website, publicdiplomacy.org. Glad all of you could be with us today. These programs are brought to you by the GWU Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, the USC Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy, and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Thank you again to Professor Allison Prasch for this groundbreaking program, and thanks to all of our members online. We look forward to seeing you on September 23rd. Goodbye for now.